Going to start taking some of the questions from our audience, and we have two questions so far. We'll take the opportunity to ask Iona in relation to token issuance as business purpose for BC. I appreciate that token issuance are excluded or not out of scope under VASP. However, do you consider the nature of the token should be assessed depending of the nature of the token, utility versus security investment token, as may fall under the scope of SEBA license application as per SEBA guidance of 2020? What are your thoughts, Iona?
Great, thank you, Elise. Good question. We're getting into regulatory perimeter stuff, which is very much in my ballpark. So just one thing to pull out of that is, of course, the reference to token issuances being excluded or out of the scope of the VASP Act. That is the case. So the sale of newly created virtual assets to the public in or from within the BVI is out of scope of our VASP Act, which has actually given us a really competitive edge in the BVI over certain other jurisdictions, like, for example, the Cayman Islands, which require approval on a kind of case-by-case basis when virtual assets are being sold to the public from, say, Cayman. So it gives us a great edge. I'm sure many of you will have dealt with initial coin offerings. So token issuers is a pretty common business setup here, where you'll have, a BVI business company, for example, and they'll want to incorporate so that they can issue tokens to the public for whatever their digital assets business is. And that is outside of scope of the VASP Act for the most part. There's obviously always caveats, but it's it's great that we have that clarity of positioning in the BVI already. In terms of the SIBA, so the Securities and Investment Business Act perimeter, that I believe Lizzie's referencing there. So even when you have a token issuance, it's always really important to first of all start the analysis by looking at the token or the asset that you're dealing with. I referenced earlier crypto futures, for example. So these are derivatives, so futures that have virtual assets as an underlying. You can also get crypto options, which similar structure. So derivatives that are structured as options with virtual assets as their underlying. So crypto futures, for example, because of the very clear guidance that we got in 2020 from the FSC, we know that they fall within scope of our Securities and Investments Business Act. So when you're dealing with something like crypto futures, you need to be thinking about the application of that act rather than virtual assets. So, you always start with the assets to begin with, because you could fall within scope of an entirely different regulation. And you may not even realize it if you just think, digital assets, crypto, and then go straight to our Virtual Assets Act. The perimeter is a little bit more, it's a little bit more tricky than that. But like I said, we have got that really clear guidance now, which is great. So yes, always start with the nature of the token, the nature of the assets, and then after that, consider the activities that are being carried on. And that's a good steer in terms of looking at where businesses will fall in terms of the scope of BVI regulation.
Okay, we have a question on what is the difference in VASP between the BVI and the Cayman.
Yes, so I mean, again, I'm not a Cayman lawyer, so just like to caveat that immediately, although I do have Cayman colleagues that can assist with, the kind of definitions in terms of the Cayman Act. But what I mentioned earlier, so this distinction in terms of the treatment of public issuances of tokens, that's the main difference really in terms of that we tend to see, at least from a day-to-day perspective. between the BVI and the Cayman Acts is that Cayman requires this kind of pre-approval for public issuances of tokens, whereas the BVI does not, is excluded from scope of our act. And therefore, of course, we get so much more issuance business in the BVI than Cayman does at this stage. So I think I'd probably stop there in terms of headline. But what I tend to see in my day-to-day practice is really where the cookie tends to crumble in terms of the distinction between the two acts. Both of them are based on the kind of FATF guidance. So, there is a lot of kind of harmony in terms of the international standard setting between the two. Okay,
Mike, I see you had your mic open.
Yeah, no, so I just wanted to add, well, I absolutely. I summarized that very, very well, and really not much to say apart from, yeah, in terms of the differences between the two acts, that there is some nuanced stuff on the odd definition, but that is the central point. That it's the Cayman one. It includes what they refer to as public issuances of crypto assets as being a VASP. Albeit that they got themselves in such a mix-up about what was public versus private that they just decided, well, it was pretty much anything. So they are restricted there, and they have to go through the VASP licensing process if that's what they want to do. But actually, the big difference between the Cayman Act and the BVI Act is, well, that's the big sort of legislative difference, but it's actually on the implementation and the oversight of it. That's the critical thing. So in Cayman, they put their VASP Act in, they regulated everything that they were going to regulate. And they invited people to make applications to get licenses. And I think in the, I don't know, the 18 months, 2 years that it's been in there, they've issued somewhere in the region of 2 or 3 licenses, if that. Whatever number it is, it's very, very small. And it took them 18 months to get one out. That was partly through lack of regulator engagement, education, manpower. There are all sorts of issues that came with that. But what it meant was that if you want to go and set up a VASP business in Cayman, certainly if you wanted to be a token issuer, it wasn't going to happen, whether you put your application in or not, because you weren't going to get one very soon. BVI like to think, and it looks to me as though we're going in the right direction here. I talked about the engagement of the regulator from an early stage, the engagement of the profession with the regulator with an early stage. The fact that, and I was very encouraged at the Meet the Regulator forum when it was very clear to me that those applications had come in, but they'd actually been reviewing them in a very comprehensive way, and they had some very clear suggestions that were going to be made in response to some of the applications. And as I said, now, there was a time we're a bit concerned we might be looking at Cayman again, but no, the responses are coming out, substantive responses, and the regulator really is looking to engage on this. So I think that is a great sign, because we need to make sure we maintain this advantage we've got over certainly our closest competitor in this field. And other competitors out there that have also introduced VASP legislation, but have been rather slow to actually process license applications or review those. Because if we can keep this advantage, then it's going to be great success for the BVI. So finally we've got something that puts us, I think, well ahead of some of our closer island competitors.
Okay.
I'll leave that there.
So I'm going to another question that we have on slide. What categories of digital asset businesses are you seeing or are you working with in the BVI? And the categories we have listed, of course, funds, custodians, exchanges, issuers, and other virtual asset service providers. So what categories of businesses are you seeing? Again, go to slido.com, or the QR code is up on the screen. We'd like to see more of you participating in the Slido questionnaire, but of course, feel free to continue to place your questions in the Q&A section of this Zoom call. So we are seeing more on the fund side. So as we move into more people are polling, but I think we have an equal number so far of the persons who've polled. Okay, so let's move into kind of a wrap-up question, which we're going to ask all of our panelists to jump in on. And what are some of the actionable strategies that our BVI professionals can engage in to become part of this business? I know Ronan and Ludwig, you talked about education. Mike, you mentioned a book that you recommended as well. I think Ronan, you also mentioned a couple of reading requirements. But I think more importantly is people learn by practicing or learn by engaging. And certainly we are seeing this as a growth area and opportunity for the BVI. But what are the key things that allow you as professionals, as businesses, to become key participants? Ronan, you've been in this business for a while. And what piqued your interest, and how did you get into it? And how did you allow yourself to have growth in this area? And so I would like all of you to answer this question. You know, Kayla, I know you are dealing with the regulatory aspect and how we can prepare for the future in terms of course, it's going to be taxed. There's nothing that's going to avoid tax. Inevitably, it's going to come. So I want each one of you to essentially give some clear, actionable strategies for persons who want to do more or engage in this space and want to learn a little bit more. Yes, we've heard about reading books, but what else can you do? And we have questions.
Maybe I'll
go ahead.
Take that first, please. I mean, I think we all have, I always say the BVI's done the hard work. You know, it has this amazing network of clients, which we all have. You know, there are literally hundreds of thousands of business companies here, and each one tells a story. And certainly, you know, let's say the emergence of the digital asset business and the gravitation towards the BVI, which happened probably from about 2016, 17, that is venture capital coming to us. You know, a lot of these token offerings, you can view them as liquid venture capital. These guys want to launch within 3 months, and the BVI gave them that framework. And you know, with VASP and these discussions, you know, they want a license within a year, but there's a roadmap that they're following. So from my perspective, you know, I've been in a very client relationship position for a registered agent, and I was constantly having these fascinating conversations with them. Spent most of lockdown working with Mike and with Ludwig when he was at Walker's, and the good people at Applebee's and Kerry Olsen and a bunch of other law firms that were all getting these digital asset inquiries. And I'd had a client who came up from Canada back in 2018 who wanted to launch their project in Canada, but the regulatory process was very uncertain. It was going to cost them about $750,000, and there was no guarantee that after 6 months they were going to be able to launch. Then they went to Barbados, company registry there was too slow. So eventually they came to the BVI looking for rescue and, you know, a quick launch. So I got this referral from one of the law firms here. Then I spent a month or so with the clients. They were teaching me about wallets. And I would say the one thing that everyone needs to do is get yourself a wallet. And even if you only get yourself $100 worth of Ethereum or Tezos, just understand the mechanics of the business we're working with. So I think follow your curiosity, speak to your compliance officer, and see what digital asset business you've got, and engage with those clients, because they're very, very keen to share knowledge. And I think Ludwig's up next, and obviously, you've followed your curiosity, and you're working in-house for one of these projects.
So how did you move from mumbo jumbo to become an expert?
Well, what helped was, so when I arrived in the BVI, I immediately was locked up in my condo at Village Quay, not to be let out for, I think, 3 or 4 months or some other crazy period. So on your own, what do you do? The one thing that really works well in Village Quay is the internet. So I was every weekend basically plowing through, what is this? And that it takes a little while, but if you back then it was harder. Now there's more stuff available. So that's one thing. There are a few key things you need to understand. I've already talked about the network and the public computer, the infrastructure aspect of it. If you start there, then you can get really worked up about crypto assets. There's actually only one crypto asset that really matters, I think, and that is the one that's called the protocol token, so ETH or TES or Bitcoin itself, which is used to pay the network for its service. So if you understand these things, and all the rest is invention, right? All the rest is just code on the chain. So if you get that. So when I went to Tezos, because after being locked up, and also wanted to understand more, I can't, of course, not everybody can do that. Go and sit with the developers. that will teach you, but it also teaches you that you don't have to understand the whole thing, right? If you use your phone, you don't have to understand exactly, as long as you know how to use your app, right? And this is not different, right? It's technology in the end. Why did we come to the BVI? I had no hesitation to recommend to my colleagues when we had a big partnership agreement with Manchester United Football Club, with Red Bull Racing, with McLaren Racing, and that was back in 21. We wanted to do NFTs. You needed a merchant vehicle. Where do you go? And so first of all, you go to the BVI because it's speed, accuracy, certainty of execution, and certainty around the regulatory regime. So it ticks all the boxes quite quickly. I think one of the challenges that BVI has is that this is not known enough. I mean, it's defaulting to Cayman or some other place, or Malta even, to Gibraltar. Why would you go there? I've heard now a lot of people have really difficult execution problems, right? Because those jurisdictions, they're good at marketing it, and once you come in, that speed of execution, the certainty, the predictability is not there. The BVI has it. So far, so good. The next step will be DeFi products. And what we need from, as a client coming to the BVI, also as a provider, but as a client coming to the BVI, what you need is already here. And I think Ronan has said that. So what I would recommend everybody is, don't shy away from this. This technology definitely is only at the start of its development, right? As these chains are improving, as that market infrastructure out there is improving, businesses that are using it will find ways of using it that you can't imagine today, right? And if you're ready to kind of house that, particularly in the startup phase, because it's so easy for the startups to get money if they have a good idea, they spin it out. But that's the other thing, right? The cost of startup is low as long as you have developers, because there is the blockchain is public utility. So let me stop here, because I can talk. My wife says I can only talk about it for 6 minutes, but I get quite excited about it.
Okay, it's definitely a passion of yours. And one of the things I cautioned is using the acronyms, because I'm not sure. And so if you can just briefly tell us what's an NFT, what's a DeFi,
Right. Sorry. Yes. So an NFT, so the system is full of misnomers, right? So the word smart contract is the stupidest word you could ever come up with, because it's not smart, it's dumb code, and it's certainly not a contract. It's code on a server, basically. So if you put that on a central server, you wouldn't call a smart contract just because it's clever code, right? So that's one thing, but that's the jargon, so use that. What's an NFT? Non-fungible token. It tells you nothing other than that it's a token that presumably cannot be exchanged for another token because it's unique. I could talk to you about it, what it means in practice on the code, and just stop me if I'm going on too long, but what it means in practice is you have a smart contract on the chain, a piece of code, and that says this record is a unit of one, and it belongs to this particular blockchain address. That's all it is. Right, so whereas normally if you have tokens or other way of doing tokens, originally the way to do tokens was to say, okay, we have a smart contract and we have a supply of X, and then they're all in interchangeable units. That's really all it is, the difference. DeFi, very quickly, beautiful word, decentralized finance. What does decentralized mean? It means you do it on the chain. But again, it's kind of a misnomer in the sense that it doesn't tell you anything, right? Because ultimately you need to figure out who controls the code that's on the chain. And if it's properly decentralized that nobody does, then you have a decentralized finance machine. But if someone is controlling it, then of course not. So all you need to do is do your usual due diligence and understanding who's holding what. Shall I stop here, Elise?
Okay. We have had discussion in the digital asset working group about why we should consider foundations. And I think we probably came to a conclusion that we have everything that we need in the BVI. Mike, can you help us answer this question on, is there any initiative from the industry to navigate and propose foundation? Because it's certainly something we have discussed at the digital asset.
The industry and various groups of the industry have looked at foundations. We looked at LLCs before. We as well. We had a movement maybe a year and a half ago to try and introduce LLC legislation here, because I think in Delaware they were trying to use LLC. Sorry, I'll go back to acronyms. So there's this concept called a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO, and they are effectively collections of people who sit out there on the ether, individuals, and they usually they get their status as a voter through holding a token, which is sort of, the token essentially is a smart contract, and they can make decisions in relation to the operation of some fund or some sort of decentralized finance platform, like peer-to-peer lending or other things. Basically, they're just sitting there as a controlling body for whatever platform it is that they're controlling, whatever function or service, whatever it is. But rather than being organized as a company with all of the regulation or legal obstacles to go with that, or a partnership or something else, they're just a sort of just a collection of persons out there that vote in the ether. One of the issues with having an organization like that is that no one really knows what it is as a legal matter, and where folks come down, or where some of the courts have come down, they said, well, actually what it really is a partnership, which isn't a great thing, because what that means then is that you are, if anything goes wrong, and somehow you'd say, well, that's a partnership, and somehow they're liable for, whatever liability that service that you are voting in relation to has incurred, then you might all be personally, jointly, and severally liable for any of those liabilities. So, a lot of cases, these DAOs might control things like peer-to-peer lending, where they collect in funds somehow, and then they make decisions as to who might get loans under this operation. So, potential for a great deal of liability. But you don't want to be a partnership in those circumstances, because everybody's on the hook. And so people have tried to develop what they call corporate wrappers. So it's somehow that you can marry up the DAO, all the flexibility and anonymity of being in a DAO, but all the protections that you'd get from being a company with limited liability. And they tried to do this in Delaware with an LLC, and they tried to do it in Wyoming as well with an LLC. And I'm not sure how far they got. Well, how many people have used the Wyoming one? And so we were looking for the BVI. We were going to have an LLC, which we didn't have, but that didn't really go anywhere. And so we were looking at a foundation. Now Cayman has a foundation, as does Panama. I think that came up in the question. And the Cayman Foundation has proved quite popular with these types of structures, that people have tried to use this foundation company as being a wrapper for a DAO. The only thing is it doesn't quite work as a true wrapper for the DAO. You can't actually wrap that DAO up and give it limited liability. What the foundation can do, though, and it's quite good at doing this, is act as a sort of service vehicle for the DAO. So the DAO doesn't exist as a legal form. It can't contract. It can't really do anything. It can vote. But what you have is then a foundation entity which acts as sort of the cipher for the DAO, if you will, in the real world. So we can go off and contract and do various things. And they're pretty they're flexible, and they have certain advantages that they're ownerless. They don't have shareholders. They don't have members. They don't have anything. They have a board and a supervisor, but nobody owns them. So and that's quite attractive for some of these digital asset structures, where they're quite keen for them to be sort of orphan structures where control sits out there with the DAO, but no one really owns the whole thing, which is quite key. So they prove very popular in Cayman, and we get a lot of business in BVI because people will they'll go to Cayman to set up their foundation, and Cayman has a lot of does still have a lot of digital asset business going through it in one way or the other. But they go to Cayman to set up the foundation, but of course Cayman can't do token issuances without a license, and it's difficult to get a license. So they come to BVI because for your DAO, usually you'll need to have DAO participants will need to have a token in order to participate. So they come to BVI to do the token issuance. So a very typical structure would be a Cayman foundation entity with a BVI issuer sitting underneath it. Sometimes people suggest Panama. Makes no real difference. You're probably better off with a Cayman one because Cayman and BVI, the laws talk to each other a little better than Panama and BVI. So that's a very typical structure, and we as a jurisdiction have benefited greatly from that. A lot of the law firms here have offices in Cayman, so folks will go to Cayman and then they'll refer that business to us, and everybody's happy because Cayman has a piece and BVI has a piece. And so we thought, well, why don't we look at getting our own foundation? So we looked at LLC. Maybe we were looking at the wrong thing, so we're going to look at foundation. Now, I think we're still looking at that. I think as an industry, there are a bunch of different groups out there that are considering it. I do think, though, a couple of things with that. One, if we pursue getting a foundation, form a foundation for BVI, it could take a while because it's not just convincing the industry. Then you have to convince the FSC. You have to convince them to put in the infrastructure for a new type of entity. It's not just a question of, but here's the legislation, it's in. You have to get the registry all geared up for taking on a new type of company. And it's a little bit of a controversial company because this is a company that exists without UBOs as such, without owners. And how you get that through some of the BOS and AML legislation is a little bit tricky, and how it's perceived can be a bit tricky. So
Mike, thank you.
But just to finish up, Elise. But you're right that yeah, it could take a while to set one up. But do we actually need one? Can we do what foundations do with some of our existing legislation? And we think it's possible, and that's something that we're looking at the moment as a sort of do we actually need to have a foundation? Can we do this all with what we have? And that could be interesting and possible.
Okay, I think we are running on the clock, so we don't have much time left. We have one question. Can you give us the interpretation and definition of a public sale? If investors have to be accredited, would this be considered a private sale and therefore outside the scope of a VAS? Who's going to answer that very quickly? And then let's wrap up and have some final words in terms of how can investors and businesses mitigate the potential risks associated with this digital assets activity, such as the volatility that we're seeing, the security breaches. People have now been fined or charged or going to prison, and the regulatory uncertainty generally in the space, and what are the opportunities. So I'm going to give each one of you 1 minute to just answer that question before we wrap up. So essentially, what are the most compelling opportunities? We've heard about that. And in this crypto digital asset revolution, and how can we mitigate the risk? So in very succinct sentence, can you answer that question? But can you answer the final question? Who's thinking that final question from our audience?
I'm very happy to take that, since I think it's maybe back in the world of regulation again. So it looks to me like this is a slightly Cayman-centric question, because in the BVI that we don't distinguish between regulating private or public sales. So all are allowed under the BVI VASP regime, because public sales are excluded from scope. Private sales are also kind of excluded from scope as well. It's just, of course, public sales tend to be more regulated than private sales, and therefore that's why the focus is always on that in terms of the industry. So I think this is a slightly more of a Cayman question. From a BVI perspective, both public and private sales of virtual assets fall outside of scope of our VASP Act at this point in time.
Okay, so I'm starting with you, Ludwig, and then quickly, the last question, very succinctly.
Very succinct. In one sentence, I think the opportunity is to use this technology to trade any asset, anytime, anywhere. And as with all trading, you need to kind of put some benchmarks around that and have a good look at where the money is flowing from and where it's going and how the trading is done, so that there is no abuse. But liquidity is a beautiful thing.
Okay, Kayla.
I suppose I'll focus on the mitigation of risk side then. Unsurprisingly for me, keeping abreast of both those local regulatory requirements, but also the global developments, basically allow us to stay ahead of the curve in this space, offer our clients a well-rounded solution, and mitigate those risks. We've seen in the past that encouraging compliance with the international standards ultimately strengthens the industry as a whole. It legitimizes our offering, and it kind of contributes to that robust regulatory framework that we've been discussing as being so critical to our collective success in this space.
Iona?
Thanks, Elise. I'll go back to probably risk and opportunity again. Despite being a regulatory lawyer where, I tend to focus more on risk, I think it's a very exciting time. I think it's about time that TradFi, or traditional finance, was challenged and shaken up a bit, and virtual assets is really doing that. And it's helping us, I think, to also look again at traditional finance and, potentially find some solutions to some of the issues that we have there.
Mike.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I think I'm with Iona on this one. It's opportunity, but then it's balancing. It's opportunity, and of course, with opportunity comes risk. We've discussed that. It's balancing the risk with the regulation, getting the regulation right. Because if we get the regulation right, we mitigate the risk and we increase the opportunity. There are folks who are setting up, and they will come to the BVI because it's regulated, and that's important because they want the badge of regulation. It's important to them. It's important as a marketing thing. A lot of people won't come to jurisdictions where there isn't regulation, but there has to be right touch regulation, so you can actually come and you can get a license. We get that right. We mitigate the risk. We highlight the image of the jurisdiction, and you take the opportunity. But there is great opportunity here. Look, I mean, the There's a lot of people involved in this industry. There's a lot of money thrown through this industry. We've somehow got to be part of it in a constructive, a regulated, and adult way. But it's important to be part of it one way or the other.
And Ronan, last but not least.
Yeah, thanks, Lise. I think our clients and your clients, they're involved in cutting edge technologies. And you look at the world around us, whether that's governments, whether that's sort of banking, a lot of these systems are 50, 60, 70, even hundreds of years out of date. These are going to need to be upgraded. And a lot of this technology is providing solutions to do this. So even though we might not, as Ludwig said, understand the tech, we have this unique opportunity to work with these projects as an island and as a community to learn and also evolve with the technology rather than being left behind. So thank you.
Okay. With that, we want to conclude today's session. We've been talking about embracing the crypto revolution and position the BVI as a global hub for virtual assets. We've heard a lot about the opportunities as well as the risk and the regulatory aspects that we should be looking out for, preparing for. We are certainly going to continue this series of discussions on positioning the BVI as a global hub for virtual assets. On our next part 2, in a couple of weeks, in the middle of December, we should have the regulator coming on board to discuss how the applications are going. We also have someone from the Asia realm who has committed to talking with us about going through the process of the application and working in this space, as well as we have Phil Graham from Harneys, as well as Ayana Hull will be joining us for part 2 of the series. And we look forward, we'll be having more discussions on positioning the BVI as a global hub for virtual assets, as well as delving into the crypto revolution. And I think it's a positive word. And I think I would like to end and say that I think the big word that came out most from all of the cloud formations was opportunity. And I think that's where we'll end. It's an opportunity for us here in this jurisdiction to take advantage of. And we certainly have to prepare ourselves for the opportunity, but to avail ourselves of the opportunity. Thank you very much for joining us. And I want to thank my panelists, Michael, Ronan, Kayla, Iona, and Ludwig, who have done a tremendous job in terms of trying to educate about this very complex subject. And I know for some, it's been a bit informative, and for some, it still remains mumbo jumbo. But at the end of the day, we are going to continue to provide an educational platform about how the BVI can get more involved in this space. I am Elise Donovan, the CEO of BVI Finance. Thank you very much. This has been another BVI Finance Breakfast Forum. Thank you for joining us.